In the annals of British royal history, few deaths have been as gruesome, as pathetic, or as utterly devoid of dignity as that of King George IV. By the time he drew his final breath on June 26, 1830, the man who had once been called the first gentleman of England had become a grotesque caricature of royalty, a bloated, decomposing mass of flesh that horrified even his own servants. This is the story of a king who died not as a monarch, but as a living corpse, abandoned by his people and despised by history itself. The transformation from dashing prince to reviled sovereign had taken decades, but the final descent into physical and moral decay accelerated dramatically in his last years. What you're about to witness is not merely the death of a king, but the complete disintegration of a human being, a cautionary tale of absolute power corrupted by absolute indulgence, told through the eyes of those who lived through the nightmare of George IV's final days. George Augustus Frederick was born on August 12, 1762, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. In his youth, he possessed every advantage that royal birth could bestow: intelligence, charm, and striking good looks that made him the toast of fashionable society. But even as a young prince, the seeds of his eventual destruction were already taking root. His father, the austere and deeply religious George III, maintained a rigid household that valued moral rectitude above all else, creating a suffocating atmosphere that the young prince found unbearable. By his 21st birthday, George had established himself at Carlton House on London's Pall Mall, where he began what would become a lifetime of systematic self-destruction. The contrast between father and son could not have been more stark. Where George III practiced frugality and moral discipline, his heir embraced excess in every conceivable form. The prince surrounded himself with dissolute companions, drank enormous quantities of alcohol, and embarked on a series of scandalous affairs that delighted the satirical press of the day. The 1780s marked the beginning of George's transformation from a handsome, young prince into something altogether more sinister. His appetite for rich food became legendary. A typical breakfast consisted of 2 pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, 3 parts of a bottle of white wine, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy. This was merely the beginning of his daily consumption, which would continue with elaborate luncheons and dinners that resembled ancient Roman orgies more than civilized meals. As his weight ballooned, so did his debts. By the 1790s, George owed astronomical sums to London's most prestigious merchants and moneylenders. Parliament repeatedly bailed him out, but each financial rescue only enabled further excess. The prince seemed incapable of learning restraint, viewing money as an inexhaustible resource that existed solely for his pleasure. His spending on clothes, furniture, art, and entertainment reached levels that shocked even the most extravagant members of the aristocracy. The prince's personal relationships proved equally destructive. His illegal marriage to the Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, in 1785, created a constitutional crisis, while his subsequent official marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 became one of the most disastrous royal unions in British history. George was so disgusted by his bride at their first meeting that he called for brandy, while Caroline observed that he was very fat and not as handsome as his portrait. Their wedding night, during which George was found unconscious and drunk in the fireplace, set the tone for a relationship that would scandalize Europe. The couple's mutual hatred became a source of public entertainment, with newspapers and satirical cartoonists documenting every sordid detail of their separation. George's treatment of Caroline, whom he later tried to divorce when he became king, demonstrated a cruelty that extended far beyond mere marital discord. He systematically excluded her from court, removed her name from the Book of Common Prayer, and even attempted to prevent her from attending his coronation. When Caroline died suddenly in 1821, many suspected that the stress of her husband's persecution had hastened her death. Throughout these decades of scandal and excess, George's body began to show the devastating effects of his lifestyle. By 1797, at age 35, he already weighed 245 pounds, an enormous size for the era. His face, once considered among the handsomest in England, began to bloat and distort. He developed a series of chins that no amount of fashionable cravats could conceal, while his once athletic frame disappeared beneath layers of fat that made simple movement increasingly difficult. The prince's vanity, however, remained intact, even as his body deteriorated. He employed an army of tailors, corset makers, and cosmetic artists to maintain the illusion of his former beauty. His corsets became engineering marvels, a bastille of whalebone, as one observer noted, designed to compress his enormous belly into some semblance of a human shape. He wore elaborate wigs to hide his thinning hair, applied rouge and powder to disguise his increasingly sallow complexion, and dressed in ever more flamboyant costumes that served to distract from his physical decay. When George III suffered his final mental breakdown in 1810, his eldest son officially became Prince Regent, wielding royal power while his father lived out his remaining years in madness and isolation. The regency period, which lasted until George III's death in 1820, should have been the pinnacle of the prince's achievement. Instead, it marked the acceleration of his personal decline and the beginning of his transformation from a merely dissolute prince into something far more sinister and pathetic. As Prince Regent, George possessed unprecedented power to reshape British society according to his tastes. He commissioned magnificent architectural projects, patronized the arts on a scale not seen since the Renaissance, and presided over some of the most glittering social seasons in London's history. Yet beneath the veneer of cultural achievement lay a growing darkness that would eventually consume him entirely. His drinking increased to levels that shocked even his hard-drinking contemporaries, while his addiction to laudanum, liquid opium, began to cloud his mind for days at a time. The regent's legendary banquets became grotesque spectacles of consumption that horrified foreign visitors. During one 6-week period in 1816, Carlton House took delivery of over 5,000 pounds of meat, not including sausages, pork, or poultry. The prince would personally consume quantities of food that seemed impossible for any human being to digest, washing it down with rivers of wine, champagne, and spirits that left him in a stupor for hours. His dinner parties lasted from early afternoon until dawn, with guests often departing in horror at the prince's behavior. By 1820, when George finally ascended to the throne as George IV, he had already become a figure of ridicule rather than respect. His coronation, which cost nearly £1 million, an unimaginable sum at the time, was criticized as an exercise in megalomaniacal excess. The new king appeared in a crown decorated with over 12,000 hired diamonds, his massive frames squeezed into silver tissue robes that made him resemble, in the words of one observer, a magnificent whale dressed for a masquerade ball. The early years of George's reign were marked by political crises that revealed his fundamental unfitness for kingship. His attempt to divorce Queen Caroline created a public spectacle that turned the British people decisively against him, while his interference in government policy demonstrated an understanding of statecraft that was both naive and dangerous. Parliament learned to work around the king rather than with him, effectively reducing him to a ceremonial figurehead whose primary function was to avoid causing further scandal. As the 1820s progressed, George's physical condition deteriorated with frightening speed. His weight climbed past 280 pounds, making him one of the most obese people in Britain. His legs, swollen with fluid retention, became so painful that he could barely walk. Stairs became impossible to climb, forcing his servants to carry him through his own palaces like a massive, breathing piece of furniture. The contrast between his public image as king and his private reality as an invalid created a cognitive dissonance that drove him deeper into isolation and dependency. The king's addiction to laudanum reached truly dangerous levels during this period. He regularly consumed over 100 drops before public appearances, enough to render most people unconscious. The drug left him in a perpetual haze, unable to focus on government business for more than a few minutes at a time. His speeches became rambling, incoherent affairs that embarrassed his ministers and delighted his enemies. Foreign diplomats reported that the King of England appeared to be either drunk or drugged during most official functions. George's eyesight began to fail catastrophically in the late 1820s, adding another layer to his already pathetic existence. Like his father, he developed severe cataracts that left him nearly blind. He underwent primitive eye surgery in September 1829, but the procedure provided little relief. By December 1828, he could no longer sign documents, forcing Parliament to create a stamp of his signature that could be applied in his presence. The king, who had once prided himself on his beautiful handwriting, could no longer write his own name. Gout, the traditional disease of the wealthy, attacked George with particular viciousness in his final years. His hands and feet became so swollen and painful that the slightest touch could send him into paroxysms of agony. He was forced to wear specially designed slippers that accommodated his grotesquely enlarged feet, while his hands became so deformed that he could no longer hold a pen or even a fork. The king, who had once been famous for his elegant mannerisms, was reduced to being fed like an infant by his increasingly revolted servants. The physical changes in George's appearance during his final years were so dramatic that they shocked even those who saw him regularly. Sir David Wilkie, who painted the king's portrait in 1829, reported that George was wasting away frightfully day by day, despite his enormous size. The artist described the experience as a most difficult and melancholy business. It compared the king to a great sausage stuffed into the covering. Wilkie's portrait, diplomatically flattering as royal portraits always were, could not entirely conceal the fact that its subject could cease to resemble a human being in any recognizable sense. George's breathing became increasingly labored. As his massive weight compressed his lungs and heart, he could no longer lie flat in bed, as the pressure on his chest threatened to suffocate him. Instead, he was forced to sleep propped upright in a specially constructed chair, his head resting on his hand, his body supported by an elaborate system of pillows and cushions. Even this position provided little comfort, as his sleep was constantly interrupted by fits of coughing and gasping that left him exhausted and desperate for more laudanum. The king's skin, once admired for its delicate complexion, became a horror to behold. Layers of fat had stretched it to the breaking point, creating folds and creases that never properly cleaned, leading to infections and sores that refused to heal. His face, bloated beyond recognition, took on a grayish hue that suggested internal decay. Servants reported that touching the king's flesh felt like pressing into raw dough, soft, yielding, and somehow unwholesome, in a way that made even hardened palace staff recoil in disgust. The smell, emanating from George's body, became one of the most frequently mentioned aspects of his final years. Despite the efforts of his valets and physicians, his massive form had become impossible to keep properly clean. The combination of infected sores, unwashed flesh folds, and the side effects of his various medications created an odor so overwhelming that servants would gag when entering his chambers. Visitors to Windsor Castle reported detecting the king's presence from rooms away, guided by an aroma that suggested decomposition had already begun. George's eating habits, already legendary for their excess, became even more disturbing in his final years. Unable to taste food properly due to his medications, he compensated by demanding ever more elaborate and heavily spiced dishes. His appetite remained enormous despite his obvious ill health, and he would consume multiple courses even when clearly in distress. The sight of the dying king frantically stuffing food into his mouth while gasping for breath became one of the most pathetic spectacles witnessed by the Windsor Castle staff. The psychological effects of George's physical deterioration were perhaps even more devastating than the bodily changes themselves. A man who had spent his entire life obsessed with his appearance was forced to confront his transformation into a grotesque parody of his former self. Mirrors were gradually removed from his private chambers on his own orders, as he could no longer bear to see his reflection. The prince, who had once spent hours each day perfecting his toilette, now avoided looking at himself entirely. His paranoia and depression deepened as his condition worsened. George became convinced that his servants were mocking him behind his back, a suspicion that was, in many cases, entirely accurate. He would fly into rages at the slightest perceived insult, then collapse into fits of weeping that could last for hours. His emotional instability, exacerbated by his drug addiction, made him increasingly difficult to manage, with even his most loyal retainers beginning to dread their duties. The king's isolation from the outside world became nearly complete as his condition deteriorated. He rarely left his private apartments, and when he did venture out, it was only in a specially constructed wheelchair that could support his enormous weight. The man who had once been the center of London's social universe now lived like a prisoner in his own palace, cut off from normal human contact by his physical limitations and his shame at his appearance. George's relationship with his physicians became increasingly antagonistic as his condition worsened. Sir Henry Halford, the royal physician, was regularly subjected to the king's verbal abuse, while other doctors found themselves dismissed for providing honest assessments of their patient's condition. George wanted medical professionals who would tell him what he wanted to hear, that recovery was possible, that his weight could be reduced, that his eyesight might return. When faced with the truth about his hopeless condition, he preferred to shoot the messenger rather than confront reality. The political implications of George's deteriorating condition became a source of growing concern for the government. A king who could barely function physically, who was addicted to drugs, and who displayed increasing signs of mental instability, posed a serious threat to the stability of the monarchy. Ministers began to discuss contingency plans for dealing with a sovereign who might become completely incapacitated while still technically alive, creating a constitutional crisis that had no clear precedent or solution. Public awareness of the king's condition gradually spread, despite the palace's attempts at secrecy. Satirical cartoonists, who had mocked George's obesity for decades, now began to depict him as a literally dying monarch whose continued existence was an embarrassment to the nation. The contrast between the official bulletins about the king's health, which spoke of indispositions and temporary setbacks, and the reality of his condition became a source of bitter humor among the British people. The servants at Windsor Castle began to display an alarming lack of respect for their royal master as his condition deteriorated. Footmen would complain openly about having to carry the king's massive weight, while chambermaids would gossip about the horrific smell that permeated his apartments. The elaborate protocols of royal service began to break down as staff members struggled to maintain their dignity while dealing with a sovereign who had clearly lost his own. George's sleep patterns became increasingly erratic as his physical discomfort intensified. He would doze fitfully during the day, then remain awake for hours during the night, demanding that servants sit with him as he struggled with pain and breathing difficulties. His nocturnal rantings, often induced by laudanum, became legendary among the palace staff, who would draw lots to determine who would have to endure the king's company during his midnight vigils. The king's appetite for alcohol remained undiminished despite his obvious ill health. He continued to consume enormous quantities of wine, champagne, and spirits, often mixing them with his laudanum in combinations that would have killed a lesser man instantly. His tolerance for alcohol had become so high that amounts which would render normal people unconscious merely made him slightly more talkative, though his speech remained slurred and largely incomprehensible. By 1829, George's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer perform even the most basic functions of kingship. He was unable to read state papers, could not sign documents, and was too confused to follow political discussions. The machinery of government continued to function around him, but the king himself had become little more than a breathing corpse that occasionally stirred to make unreasonable demands or issue incoherent orders that everyone ignored. The physical act of moving George from room to room became a major logistical challenge that required teams of servants and specialized equipment. A chair with wheels was constructed to transport him, but even this proved inadequate for someone of his size and medical condition. The sound of the king being moved through the palace corridors, the creaking of machinery, the grunts of straining servants, and George's own labored breathing became an audible reminder of the monarchy's degradation. George's personal hygiene, never particularly rigorous even in his healthier days, became virtually non-existent as his condition worsened. His servants struggled to keep him clean, but his size and medical condition made proper washing nearly impossible. The king would sometimes go for weeks without a proper bath, his unwashed body adding to the already overwhelming odor that marked his presence. Visitors to the palace learned to breathe through their mouths when in the king's vicinity. The contrast between George's public image and private reality reached its most extreme point during his final years. Official portraits continued to show a dignified monarch in splendid robes, but those who actually encountered the king described a creature that bore little resemblance to these idealized depictions. The gap between royal propaganda and lived reality became so vast that it seemed almost surreal, as if two completely different people were being discussed. Drug addiction had rendered George's mental state unpredictable and often dangerous. He would experience periods of apparent lucidity, followed by episodes of complete confusion where he would fail to recognize even his closest servants. His memory became so unreliable that he would forget conversations that had taken place minutes earlier, then fly into rages when reminded of his forgetfulness. The king's mental deterioration made him increasingly paranoid and suspicious of everyone around him. The religious awakening that George experienced in his final months added another layer of pathos to his already tragic situation. The man who had spent decades in open defiance of Christian morality suddenly became obsessed with securing divine forgiveness for his sins. He would spend hours confessing his misdeeds to increasingly uncomfortable clergymen, detailing a lifetime of debauchery with a specificity that horrified his listeners. His newfound piety seemed genuine, but was undermined by his continued inability to modify his destructive behavior. George's appetite for laudanum had become so enormous that his physicians feared he might accidentally overdose himself during one of his confused episodes. The amount of opium in his bloodstream was sufficient to kill several ordinary people, yet the king's tolerance was so high that he appeared to function normally, or at least as normally as his condition allowed. His doctors began to dilute his medication without telling him, but George would demand larger and larger doses to achieve the same effect. The king's relationship with food became increasingly dysfunctional as his death approached. Despite his obvious inability to properly digest meals, he continued to demand elaborate multi-course dinners that he would consume with mechanical determination. The sight of George forcing down food while clearly in distress became one of the most disturbing aspects of his final period, suggesting a man who had lost all connection to his own physical needs and limitations. Personal relationships became virtually impossible for George as his condition deteriorated. His longtime mistress, the Marchioness Conyngham, gradually distanced herself in the court as the king's appearance became too grotesque to endure. His few remaining friends found excuses to avoid visiting Windsor Castle, leaving George surrounded only by paid servants who could barely conceal their revulsion at his presence. The king, who had once been surrounded by admirers and sycophants, died essentially alone. The smell of decay that surrounded George became so overwhelming that it began to affect the other residents of Windsor Castle. Queen Adelaide, the wife of George's brother, William, who would become William IV, reportedly moved to different quarters to escape the odor. Servants began to volunteer for duties that would take them away from the king's apartments, while those who remained would wrap cloths around their faces to filter the air they breathed. George's delusions became more elaborate and disconnected from reality as his death approached. He would sometimes claim to have fought at the Battle of Waterloo, despite having spent the entire Napoleonic Wars safely in England. His fantasies of military glory provided a stark contrast to his actual condition as an immobile invalid who could barely lift his own head. These episodes of grandiose thinking alternated with periods of profound depression, where George would weep for hours about his waste of life. The king's final months were marked by an increasing series of medical crises that his physicians were powerless to address. His heart, struggling to pump blood through his massive body, began to fail more frequently. His breathing became so labored that even the slightest exertion would leave him gasping and blue-faced. His doctors knew that death was inevitable, but they were unable to predict exactly when or how it would occur, leaving everyone in a state of grim anticipation. Physical pain became George's constant companion during his final period. The combination of gout, dropsy, heart failure, and various other ailments created a symphony of suffering that no amount of laudanum could completely suppress. He would cry out in agony during the night, his screams echoing through the palace corridors and terrifying the staff. The king's pain was so obvious and so constant that even his harshest critics began to feel a measure of pity for his suffering. The breakdown of normal palace protocol during George's final months reflected the extraordinary nature of his condition. Servants who would normally have been dismissed for the slightest impropriety now openly discussed their master's disgusting condition. The rigid hierarchy that governed royal households began to collapse as staff members struggled to cope with duties that went far beyond anything they'd been trained to handle. The monarchy itself seemed to be decomposing along with its sovereign. George's awareness of his own approaching death created a terror that was painful to witness. Despite his physical suffering, he clung desperately to life, begging his doctors for treatments that might extend his existence even briefly. His fear of death was so intense that he would refuse to sleep, convinced that he might not wake up. This existential dread added a psychological dimension to his suffering that made his final months even more harrowing for those who witnessed them. The king's bowel movements became a matter of urgent medical concern as his digestive system began to fail. The enormous quantities of food he consumed could no longer be properly processed, leading to painful blockages that would last for days. When relief finally came, it was often accompanied by blood and other alarming signs that his internal organs were shutting down. These intimate medical details were discussed openly by the palace staff, who had long since abandoned any pretense of royal dignity. Religious visitors to the dying king reported that George's confessions had become so detailed and disturbing that they questioned whether hearing them was good for their own spiritual health. The king's recounting of his lifetime of sins was so comprehensive and graphic that it seemed less like repentance than a final indulgence in the very behaviors he claimed to regret. His spiritual advisors struggled to provide comfort to a man whose guilt appeared to be as enormous as his physical bulk. The political establishment began to prepare for George's death with an eagerness that bordered on the indecent. His brother William, the heir apparent, was briefed on royal protocols while George still lived, and government ministers made little effort to conceal their relief at the prospect of a new monarch. The contrast between the official expressions of concern for the king's health and the private preparations for his succession revealed just how thoroughly George had alienated everyone around him. George's final weeks were marked by a series of false alarms that kept the palace staff in a constant state of alert. He would appear to be dying, only to rally temporarily before relapsing into crisis again. These episodes took a psychological toll on everyone involved, creating an atmosphere of perpetual tension that made normal life impossible. The king's refusal to die cleanly and quickly seemed like one final act of selfishness that inconvenienced everyone around him. The king's last days were spent in a specially fitted chair that allowed him to sleep in an upright position, his head resting on his hand for support. This pathetic image, a king who could no longer lie down in his own bed, became symbolic of how completely his physical condition had compromised his dignity. Servants would watch him struggling to breathe in this uncomfortable position, his massive body shaking with the effort of drawing air into his failing lungs. On the night of June 25, 1830, George's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. His breathing became even more labored than usual, and his color turned an alarming shade of gray that suggested complete circulatory failure. His physicians knew that the end was near, but the king himself seemed unaware of how close death had come. He dismissed Sir Henry Halford for the evening and settled into his chair for what would be his final sleep as a living man. Sir Wathin Waller, George's ophthalmologist, and one of his few remaining loyal companions, sat with the dying king through his final night. The scene was both pathetic and touching. A grossly obese, dying monarch holding hands with one of the few people who still cared enough to stay with him. The contrast between George's enormous, failing body and this simple human gesture of companionship highlighted the tragedy of a life that had been lived without genuine love or friendship. As dawn approached on June 26, 1830, George began to show signs of final distress. His breathing became increasingly irregular, and his massive body seemed to be shutting down system by system. At approximately 3 in the morning, he awakened from his fitful sleep and experienced what would be his final crisis, a bloody bowel movement that signaled the complete failure of his digestive system. The king's last coherent act was to call for his physician, allegedly crying out, Sir Henry, fetch him. This is death." The final moments of George IV's life were as undignified as everything that had preceded them. According to various accounts, his last words were either, "Surely, this must be death. Good God, what is this?" or simply incoherent groaning as his massive body finally succumbed to the cumulative damage of decades of abuse. He died at 3:15 a.m. on June 26, 1830, his head falling onto his page's shoulder as his tortured breathing finally ceased. The autopsy that followed George's death revealed the full extent of the internal damage that his lifestyle had caused. His physicians found massive deposits of fat around all his vital organs, particularly his heart and kidneys. The quantity of fat was so enormous that it had literally crushed his internal organs, making normal function impossible. His stomach showed evidence of the ruptured blood vessel that had caused his final crisis, while his liver displayed the characteristic damage of chronic alcoholism. The news of George IV's death spread through London with remarkable speed, but the public reaction was unlike anything seen for a previous monarch. Instead of the traditional outpouring of grief and mourning, there was barely concealed relief and, in many cases, open celebration. The Times, the most respected newspaper of the day, published what may be the most damning obituary ever written for a British king, asking pointedly, "What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow?" The paper continued its devastating assessment. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. If he ever had a friend, a devoted friend in any rank of life, we protest that the name of him or her never reached us. This brutal honesty reflected a broader public sentiment that George IV had been not just a bad king, but a fundamentally repugnant human being whose death was cause for celebration rather than mourning. The practical challenges of preparing George's body for burial provided one final humiliation for the dead monarch. His enormous size made normal funeral preparations impossible, requiring specially constructed equipment and reinforcements to handle his weight. The coffin had to be made of Spanish mahogany, lined with lead to contain his massive form, while the palace corridors required protective wooden panels to prevent damage from the weight of the casket and its grotesque contents. Even in death, George's body continued to emit the odor that had made his final years so unpleasant for those around him. Undertakers working on the corpse complained about the smell, while the embalming process proved more difficult than usual due to the king's size and the advanced state of decay that had apparently begun even before his death. The man who had once been obsessed with perfumes and cosmetics had become a source of revulsion that no amount of preparation could entirely mask. The lying in state at Windsor Castle was notable for the lack of genuine mourning among the visitors. While protocol demanded that people dress in black and maintain appropriate solemnity, observers noted that the atmosphere was more curious than sorrowful. Many came to gawk at the massive casket rather than pay their respects, while others seemed to be confirming that George was actually dead rather than mourning his passing. The funeral procession itself became a subject of mockery rather than reverence. Contemporary accounts describe courtiers telling commonplace jokes during the ceremony, while the general atmosphere suggested relief rather than grief. Even George's brother William, who became William IV, was reported to have shown inappropriate excitement about his new role as king, behaving with a lack of decorum that shocked even those accustomed to royal dysfunction. The funeral service in St. George's Chapel was marked by considerable noise and disruption that had nothing to do with genuine emotion. The sounds came not from weeping mourners, but from restless attendees who seemed eager for the proceedings to end so they could return to normal life. The contrast with the genuine grief that had marked other royal funerals was stark and commented upon by virtually everyone present. The burial itself required special engineering to handle George's enormous coffin. The floor of the royal vault had to be reinforced to support the weight, while additional pulleys and supports were installed to lower the casket safely. Even his final mechanical process seemed to symbolize how George's physical excess had complicated every aspect of his existence, making even death more difficult and expensive than it needed to be. The immediate aftermath of George's death revealed just how thoroughly he had alienated everyone who had known him. No genuinely touching tributes emerged from friends or loved ones. No heartfelt reminiscences of private kindnesses or hidden virtues. Instead, the overwhelming response was relief that a national embarrassment had finally ended, freeing Britain from the shame of being represented by such a grotesque and dysfunctional monarch. The Duke of Wellington, perhaps the most respected figure in Britain at the time, provided a typically blunt assessment of a dead king. He was the worst man he ever fell in with his whole life. The most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, the most entirely without one redeeming quality. This judgment from a man who had known George personally for decades carried particular weight and reflected the views of many who had dealt with the king professionally. The transition to William IV was marked by an almost palpable sense of relief throughout the government and court. While William had his own eccentricities and limitations, he represented a dramatic improvement over his predecessor simply by virtue of being functional as a human being. The contrast between the two brothers, one a grotesque invalid, the other at least capable of basic royal duties, highlighted just how completely George had failed in every aspect of his role. Historical assessments of George IV's reign have been uniformly negative, with historians struggling to find any positive legacy from his decade as king. His architectural patronage and cultural contributions, while significant, have been overshadowed by his personal failures and the damage he did to the institution of monarchy. Most scholars conclude that Britain would have been better served if George had never been born, let alone become king. The medical lessons from George's death were largely ignored by contemporary observers, who were more interested in the moral and political implications of his failure than in understanding the physiological processes that had killed him. His death from obesity-related complications was unusual for the time and might have provided valuable insights into the health risks of extreme overeating and alcoholism. But these opportunities for medical advancement were missed. The satirical press had a field day with George's death and funeral, producing cartoons and commentary that mocked everything from his enormous coffin to the lack of genuine mourners. The artistic tradition of royal satire reached new heights of viciousness in response to George's death, with artists feeling free to express opinions about the monarchy that had been building for decades but could not be voiced while the king lived. The cost of George's funeral and burial added one final insult to a reign that that have been marked by financial excess. The elaborate ceremonies, special equipment, and reinforcements required to handle his massive body cost the treasury thousands of pounds at a time when the country was struggling with debt. Even in death, George managed to be more expensive and troublesome than any normal person would have been.